Hello, MCU fans! Now that Brave New World has finally shown up on Disney Plus, it's time to look at where it happens in the MCU timeline. And I've actually done videos on everything in Phase 5, and my next video after this will be a summary of the entire Phase 5 and how it all fits together. But of course, today is Brave New World. Now, there will be spoilers for the movie, but as long as you're okay with that, then let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget, we have a June contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, and you could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. And we have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out in case you're interested. And hang around to the end of the video, and I'll talk about the Doomsday Countdown Watch on the Discord. Alright, so it's important to start by reminding that the Disney Plus timeline is considered MCU canon, because Brad Winderbaum himself said, that's our medium to define canon now, which is wild to think about. Okay, so where does it fall in the Disney Plus timeline? It's right at the end after Daredevil Born Again, and most importantly, it is after Secret Invasion. And that's the TV show that's going to have the most impact on Brave New World's timeline. So when does it happen? Well, my goodness, did they just give us a full date in the movie? That is crazy, right? Thursday, April 16th, 2027 is when the main part of the movie is happening. Now, it is worth noting that April 16th in 2027 is actually a Friday, but I'm suspecting that that accident happened because the movie was delayed. Remember, it was supposed to come out at least a year ago, maybe even longer. So anyway, I love the fact that we get a full date in the movie. So that means the election night victory party we see at the beginning of the movie is happening in November of 2026, when they say the next president of the United States of America is Thaddeus Ross. So when would a November 2026 election occur? That would be on Tuesday, November 3rd of 2026. But of course, in the real world, we did not have a presidential election in 2026. So we'll talk more about that, but I do want to point out that some people have mentioned the Daily Bugle website kind of made it confusing on whether or not there was a presidential election in 2024, because on that website, there's this article, and in particular, if we zoom in on part of it, it says, "Did you make it to the polls this week to vote? Our government is a bit distracted counting the ballots." Now, this article was published after Far From Home came out and basically trying to get the hype up for No Way Home, which of course occurred in 2024. So therefore, people have said, well, hey, there's a presidential election in 2024. Isn't that an issue? Not really, because notice it does not mention presidential election. So this must have just been a congressional election, which does happen every 2 years. All right, so back to the election night victory party. Ross is saying, tonight, America has spoken in one of the most important elections of our lifetimes. And I love that his motto is together, because I can't help but wonder if that's not to distance himself from Ritson, who famously signed that bill that designated all off-world born species as enemy combatants. And then, of course, he threw in, and we will kill every last one of you. Not really the model of togetherness, right? So I can see why Ross would choose together to say, I am very different from this guy. All right, we definitely know he ran for an election because Ross says they said lose the mustache or lose the election. But interestingly, there is no mention of Ritson. I'm kind of bummed. I wish they would have mentioned him, but they didn't. Although in Secret Invasion, they basically hinted that he's only going to have a one-term presidency. Okay, so Ritson lost and Ross won, and we'll come back to why there was a presidential election in 2026 in a minute. So we jump from November to April, 5 months later, and in fact, the movie makes it really clear that we're 5 months later because Ross says, I'm coming up on the end of my first 100 days. Well, presidents take office on January 20th, and if we move 100 days from January 20th in 2027, that would be Friday, April 30th of 2027. And of course, we learned that the movie's basically taking place in mid-April, so that works perfectly. And we also see that the cherry trees are in bloom, and that happens in late March, early April. And we get a lot of other cool timeline indicators. Sam and Torres have worked together for 3 years. That works perfectly because they started working together in spring of 2024, so that's been 3 years. And we learned that it's been 2 years after Isaiah was exonerated. The news says Isaiah Bradley is set to go before a military judge tomorrow, just 2 years after being exonerated for unjust charges. Now, this works. I mean, he was exonerated basically in summer of 2024, which is less than 3 years by just a little bit, but it is less than 3 years, so that works. And then this works really well. Ross has kept the leader prisoner for 16 years. So it's important. The leader says, once Ross discovered how useful I could be, he kept me here for 16 years. Well, the Incredible Hulk movie is in spring of 2010, so you might at first say, well, shouldn't we have said 17 years? But remember, the leader said, once he discovered I could be useful. So probably it took 6 months up to a year before Ross realized, hey, I can work with this dude and maybe even become president. And I need to do a video at some point on all the ways that the leader might have shaped the MCU. That's pretty crazy to think. All right, so now let's talk about this whole presidential election in 2026. How exactly did that work out? Well, I've done a longer video on all the presidents in the MCU. You can check that out if you're interested. But we do know that Trump was president and would have started his term in 2017. But was he blipped? And then there's Biden. We don't even know if he was president. There is no mention of him in the MCU. We do know that Ritson lost an election in 2026, so maybe did the blip move the election cycle? And of course, we know Ross won and started his term in 2027, but we don't know who his vice president was, and that's important because, of course, he steps down at the end of the movie. Okay, so I'm going to throw out that Trump was blipped, and we'll talk about why in just a second, but let's discuss what would happen if Trump was blipped. So, there is an order of succession if something happens to the president, such as he's unable to hold office, and yes, if you're blipped, you can't hold office. There is literally 18 people, 18 that could become president in order based on the president, not being able to serve. But here's the thing, several of them were probably also blipped. And then by the time we get down on that list a bit, you may run into somebody who doesn't even want to be president or is totally unqualified. I mean, think about it. It was a mess. I mean, we've got the New York Harbor with all the boats sitting there, right? And then potentially half of the medical industry was blipped. Half of the energy industry was blipped. Half of the food industry was blipped. So I'm wondering if whoever became president didn't even want the office, right? So therefore, keep in mind that the U.S. Constitution, as well as the amendments to the Constitution, determine when we have our elections. And there have been 27 amendments to the Constitution. So I'm throwing out that most definitely there could have been a vote to have a new presidential election due to the turmoil caused by the blip. So in that case, Trump's gone, right? Well, let's just say Biden won to put him in. I mean, it doesn't really matter. We don't know who this person was, but somebody was president from 2019 to 2022 in this scenario. That means Ritson could win at the end of 2022 and start serving in 2023. Of course, Trump would now come back from the blip, no longer president. That would be interesting to see how he took that. Not well, I suspect. And then, of course, Ross ended up stepping down at the end of the movie. And again, we don't know who his vice president is, so we don't know who the current president is. So I don't know. I have no idea if Marvel's going to go this direction. I just know that it works. So, hey, if you're listening, Marvel, if the Timeline Keeper is watching this video, here's an idea for you. Anyway, let's talk about some other interesting things in the movie that are timeline related. The Avengers are no longer a group, right? Because Ross says, which is why I want you, Captain America, to help me rebuild the Avengers. And his response, Sam, is like, well, when you passed the Sokovia Accords, you tore the Avengers apart. But what that's saying is, not only did it tear them apart, they never started meeting again. Isn't that just crazy? I mean, keep in mind, the Sokovia Accords were repealed. In the She-Hulk show, we learned that they were repealed at some point prior to that episode, and that was in, summer of 2025. So, yeah, it's just wild to think the Avengers never met again, but that's why there wasn't a team, come Thunderbolts. All right, we also learned that Bucky is running for Congress. He talks about having a campaign fundraiser, and in fact, they even call him the future congressman. So that might mean he's already won. He just hasn't been, officially installed in office yet. So how do you win in the middle of a year? Well, it's probably a special election because basically if someone in office resigns, dies, or is removed from office, you can have a special election, and that's likely how Bucky won and why he was in Congress by the time we get to Thunderbolts. So talking about Bucky, let's discuss this dude's age. So Sam says that he's 110 years old in April of 2027 when this movie's happening. All right, that's fine. However, Bucky himself said he's 106 in April of 2024 during Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So how does that work? He should have been 107 in this case, because it's only 3 years prior to the movie. And then let's throw in the fact that in the Thunderbolts, no spoilers if you haven't seen the movie, but Bucky himself says he was 90 in May of 2012 because Val's assistant is saying, I was in high school when the aliens came, referring to the first Avengers movie, and he's like, high school, huh? I was like 90. Okay, so how do we put all this together? Well, let's start by trying to figure out when was he born. So in the Winter Soldier movie, we get his birth. Really easy, right? It was 1917. So we can move on, right? Well, not necessarily, because it also tells us he was born in 1916. Now, I'm just going to be honest. Having this thing be that messed up, this is giving the 8 years later a run for its money. I mean, honestly, how do the prop people let this go? But okay, let's just say it's 1917 for convenience sake. So we learned he's 110 in 2027. That actually works, right? 110 after 1917. Well, except for the fact that he's counting the blip years. That's cheating. You can't count your blip years because Bucky wasn't around. So, man, once again, I really want to know how Marvel is handling blip years. But okay, it gets crazier though, because during the first Avenger movie, there's some props, which granted technically aren't canon because they never appeared in the movie. But notice we get a birthday for Bucky, and it is March of 1922. Well, here's what's interesting. 1922 plus 90 is 2012. So that actually works with what he said in the Thunderbolts movie for how old he was during Avengers. But he can't have been born in 1916, 1917, and 1922. So I don't have an answer. Hopefully Marvel will officially give us when he was born at some point. But I also think Bucky might just be making up his age each time. I mean, the dude doesn't care. That's the bottom line. I mean, you could call this a continuity error. I call this Bucky just messing with people. Adding in the blip years, saying he's all these different years. I think that would be really funny if every time he gives his age, it's something different. All right, so that's everything I wanted to discuss from a timeline standpoint in the movie. So now it's time to add the movie to the circuit board diagram that I've been keeping track of. So first we need a line coming out of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. That's for Sam, Bucky, and Torres. And then I'm going to add a line for Eternals. I mean, it's kind of weird to do one for Tiamat, but I don't know if any other lines are going to come out of Eternals, to be honest. So I'm not going to add a line for either Ross or the leader because I only do it for heroes. Otherwise, this thing would be even messier than it already is. So now we look at Phase 5. This is everything so far in Phase 5. So now we can add in Captain America Brave New World in April of 2027. Here's our line for Sam, Torres, and Bucky. And here's our line for good old Tiamat. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in Thunderbolts. You can check out my breakdown of that movie if you want to know why I'm putting it in October of 2027. But this now completes everything in Phase 5. And speaking of, remember, my next video will be a timeline recap of everything in Phase 5, how it all fits together, and how I think things look as we head into Phase 6 and its timeline. So that should be a lot of fun. But for this video, let me know your thoughts on the timeline placement for Captain America Brave New World. You know I love to read and respond to everything. Don't forget, we have that June contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook. And we have the membership option in case you're interested in that. And I always love to mention the Discord. Here we are in the timeline section where the conversation is always hopping. Join in if you want to talk timelines. And I promised I would mention the Doomsday Countdown watch parties. Every date listed here at 7 p.m. Eastern. We'll be watching a different movie or show as we prepare for the December 18th, 2026 release of Doomsday. So, 2,200 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.